The National Electrical Code, or NEC, sets standards for safe electrical installations. Article 300.5 addresses underground cables requiring a minimum burial depth of 18 inches and protection from physical damage. Article 300.12 mandates protection from moisture and corrosion for cables installed in damp or wet locations, such as crawl spaces. Several options exist for running cable in a crawl space. Option 1 involves burying the cable underground. If feasible, dig a trench under the crawl space and bury the cable at least 18 inches deep. Protect the cable with a conduit or other approved means. Option 2 considers running the cable on the crawl space floor. NEC 300.5 C1 provides an exception, allowing underground cables to be run on or under the floor if they are interred at least 12 inches deep in a raceway with a removable cover, or protected from physical damage by other approved means, for example, a concrete slab or gravel fill. Attach the cable to the floor joist or studs to prevent it from moving or being damaged. Option 3 explores running the cable above ground. This option is not typically allowed by the NEC for underground cables. However, it may be possible if you use an approved method, such as installing the cable in a conduit or raceway mounted on the floor joists, or running the cable through holes drilled in the floor joists, making sure you have grommets for protection. There are additional considerations to keep in mind. Using a conduit or raceway is recommended to protect the cable from moisture, insects, and rodents. Installing a ground fault circuit interrupter, or GFCI, at the panel is required for all outdoor circuits, including those running to a barn. Always check with your local building inspector to confirm any additional requirements or restrictions. Based on the NEC in your specific situation, the best option would be to bury the cable underground if possible. However, if that is not feasible, you can run the cable on the crawl space floor provided you meet the requirements for a raceway or other approved protection method. The National Electrical Code Article 300.5 covers requirements for underground installations. It states that underground cables must be buried at a certain depth, typically 18 inches, to protect them from physical damage from things like digging or soil shifting. The NEC also addresses how to handle cables in damp or wet locations like crawl spaces in Article 300.12. It emphasizes the need to protect cables from moisture and corrosion. This is especially important in crawl spaces where humidity and dampness can be prevalent. Let's look at the options for running the cable in the crawl space. Option 1 is to bury the cable underground within the crawl space. This would involve digging a trench at least 18 inches deep. You would need to protect the cable within the trench, often by using a conduit. This protects it from physical damage and moisture. Option 2 is to run the cable directly on the crawl space floor. There is an exception in NEC 300.5 C1 that allows underground cables to be run on or under the floor under certain conditions. These conditions are that the cables must be either interred at least 12 inches deep in a raceway with a removable cover or protected from physical damage by other approved means. Examples of approved means include covering the cable with a concrete slab or a layer of gravel fill. Additionally, you would want to secure the cable to the floor joists or studs to prevent it from moving and potentially getting damaged. Option 3 is to run the cable above ground. This option is generally not recommended by the NEC for underground cables. However, it could be permissible if the cable is installed in a conduit or raceway that is mounted on the floor joists. You could also run the cable through holes drilled in the floor joists, but you would need to use grommets to protect the cable from abrasion where it passes through the wood. When running electrical cable, consider using a conduit or raceway. This provides an extra layer of protection against moisture, insects, and rodents, all of which can be found in crawl spaces. Also, ensure you install a ground fault circuit interrupter, or GFCI, at the electrical panel. GFCI protection is required for all outdoor circuits, including those that run to a barn. Finally, always check with the local building inspector. Local codes may have additional requirements or restrictions that you need to follow in addition to the NEC. To summarize, if possible, burying the cable underground is usually the best option. However, if digging is not feasible, running the cable on the crawl space floor is an acceptable alternative, provided you follow the NEC guidelines for protection and secure the cable properly. Remember, safety should be the priority when dealing with electrical wiring. Article 300.5 of the National Electrical Code deals with underground installations, and this article specifies the requirements for burying electrical cables. This is to ensure that the cables are protected from physical damage such as digging, impact, or ground movement. The general rule is that underground cables must be buried at least 18 inches deep. However, this depth can vary depending on the specific application and the type of cable used. For example, direct burial cables, which are designed to be buried directly in the ground, may have different depth requirements than cables that are installed in a conduit. Article 300.12 of the NEC addresses the installation of cables in damp or wet locations, and this is particularly relevant to crawl spaces. Crawl spaces are often damp or wet environments, and the NEC requires that cables installed in these locations be protected from moisture and corrosion. This can be achieved by using cables that are specifically designed for wet locations, such as underground feeder or off cable, or by installing the cables in a conduit. When running cable in a crawl space, there are a few different options to consider. The first option is to bury the cable underground. This is the most common approach, and it involves digging a trench in the crawl space and burying the cable at least 18 inches deep. The cable should also be protected from physical damage by installing it in a conduit or by using a direct burial cable. The second option is to run the cable on the crawl space floor. This option is allowed by the NEC under certain circumstances. Specifically, the NEC allows underground cables to be run on or under the floor if they are interred at least 12 inches deep in a raceway with a removable cover, or if they are protected from physical damage by other approved means. Approved means of protection include covering the cable with a concrete slab or a layer of gravel fill. The third option is to run the cable above ground. This option is typically not allowed by the NEC for underground cables. However, it may be possible if you use an approved method, such as installing the cable in a conduit or raceway mounted on the floor joists or running the cable through holes drilled in the floor joists. If you choose to run the cable through holes drilled in the floor joists, you will need to use grommets to protect the cable from abrasion. There are also some additional considerations to keep in mind when running cable in a crawl space. Firstly, it is recommended to use a conduit or raceway to protect the cable from moisture, insects, and rodent. Secondly, it is required to install a ground fault circuit interrupter, or GFCI, at the panel for all outdoor circuits, including those running to a barn. Thirdly, it is important to check with your local building inspector to confirm any additional requirements or restrictions. Based on the NEC and your situation, the best option would be to bury the cable underground if possible. However, if that is not feasible, you can run the cable on the crawl space floor provided you meet the requirements for a raceway or other approved protection method. Article 300.5 dictates the rules for underground installations. It says any underground cables need to be buried deep enough to protect them from damage. The specific depth depends on the situation. Usually, it's at least 18 inches. Article 300.12 focuses on keeping cables safe in damp or wet spots, like your crawl space. It stresses the importance of protecting cables from moisture and corrosion. You can use special cables made for wet areas, like underground feeder cable, or put the cables inside a conduit for extra protection. Let's explore your options for running the cable. Option 1 is burying the cable underground inside the crawl space. Dig a trench that's at least 18 inches deep. Make sure to protect the cable by putting it in a conduit or using direct burial cable. Option 2 involves running the cable on the floor of the crawl space. There's an exception in NEC 300.5. C1 that lets you do this if you meet certain requirements. You can bury the cable at least 12 inches deep in a raceway with a removable cover. Or, you can protect it from damage using something like a concrete slab or gravel fill. Secure the cable to the floor joists to prevent it from moving. Option 3 considers running the cable above ground. This isn't usually allowed for underground cables. but you might be able to do it if you use an approved method. This could mean installing the cable in a conduit or raceway attached to the floor joists. Another way is to run the cable through holes in the floor joists, using grommets to protect the cable from rubbing. Here are some extra things to think about. Using a conduit or raceway is a good idea to protect the cable from moisture, insects, and rodents. Make sure to install a ground fault circuit interrupter, or GFCI, at the electrical panel. This is needed for all outdoor circuits, including the one going to your barn. Double check with your local building inspector to see if there are any other rules you need to follow. Generally, burying the cable underground is the best approach if you can. If that's not possible, running it in the crawl space floor is okay, as long as you follow the guidelines for protection.